All right, we're going to get cracking. Welcome everyone to the briefing room for the fifth in a series of ClimateWorks webinars, this one entitled Food and Land Use Transitions. My name's Eli Court. I'm a program manager at ClimateWorks Australia. I manage the Land Use Futures program, which is a multi-year cross-sectoral initiative supporting the shift to sustainable food and land use in Australia. And before we introduce our speakers this afternoon, I'd first like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands the ClimateWorks office is located. I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders, past, present and emerging. And in particular, given the topic for today, I'd like to acknowledge the very, very long Indigenous tradition of custodianship of this land, about which we are just beginning to learn. I'd also like to make a special mention to all of our philanthropic supporters, our program partners and our colleagues who are with us online today. We deeply value your support and involvement, and this indeed is what makes this work at all possible. A reminder that those of you who registered via Zoom will receive an email afterwards with links to the resources mentioned in the discussion. So make sure you check your inbox and your spam folder in case it ends up there. And we are running this event as a panel. We have two wonderful guests. Each of them will speak for about 5 minutes each, leaving plenty of time for audience questions. If you're on Zoom, you'll see down the bottom of the screen a Q&A button. You can use this function to submit questions, and our team will be selecting questions to put to our guests after the presentations. Today's session on food and land follows webinars on ClimateWorks Decarbonisation Futures National Research and deep dives into the energy and transport sectors. And those discussions were recorded just as this one is. So if you're interested, you can check out all of our past webinars on the ClimateWorks website. And we're going to keep that series going. The next one is on buildings. I think it's on the 22nd of July. So look out for that one and other upcoming briefing room events. So that's it for the formalities. So today we are very fortunate to have with us two wonderful guests. Firstly, we have Verity Morgan-Schmidt, a farmer and the Policy and Partnerships Director at Farmers for Climate Action, a network of over 5,000 farmers across Australia working for positive climate solutions. And we also have Dr Shenggen Fan, Chair Professor at China Agricultural University and Ambassador of the International Food and Land Use Coalition Network. Shenggen is a global leader in agricultural economics and food policy, and he was previously the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute and a member, Vice Chair and Chair of the Food and Nutrition Council of the World Economic Forum. So we're very grateful to have both Verity and Shenggen join us today. Before we go to our panelists, a quick bit of context from me. So before I started to work at ClimateWorks on food and land use, I spent almost 10 years working on energy and the built environment. And that sector certainly presented challenges, but looking back, it was really nothing compared to the complexities of the food, agriculture and land use system. Looking into the future, the challenges facing this system are really daunting. Climate change, ecosystem decline, a rapidly growing global population and growing demand for food and fibre, along with new land uses competing for a finite supply of land and an even smaller supply of arable land. And ClimateWorks' recent Decarbonisation Futures report confirmed that farmers and value chain players throughout the food, agriculture and land use system, as well as every one of us as consumers of food and fibre products, do have a critical role to play in meeting climate goals, both through reducing emissions and drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. And I won't talk too much about that report today, but we will be sharing links to it if you want to find out more. But when we look beyond emissions, study after study tells us that finding the balance between feeding people, supporting strong regional and agricultural economies, maintaining a healthy environment and tackling climate change is going to be a huge challenge. And really meeting every one of our objectives to the fullest extent is likely out of reach. We're really in the realm of making hard choices to manage inevitable trade-offs. That said, the food, agriculture and land use system also offers some of the most hopeful and exciting possibilities of the future, including nature-based solutions and rapidly developing technologies that offer the possibility of producing nutritious food while rehabilitating natural systems that ultimately underpin our health, our communities and our economy. So, you know, there is a massive challenge ahead of us, but also really personally, I find this sector to present some of the most exciting possibilities for the future. This webinar is part of a current ClimateWorks program, the Land Use Futures program, which is building and expanding upon the decarbonisation futures analysis to produce more detailed national sustainable food and land use pathways. And this program will include, over and above the decarbonisation futures work, analysis of multiple dimensions of sustainability, not looking just at emissions, but also at water, soil and biodiversity alongside social and economic outcomes. We'll also be taking a stronger focus on revealing some of the trade-offs between different social, economic and environmental objectives, including the very significant trade-offs associated with carbon forestry. We'll also be looking at a range of additional solutions beyond what was modelled in decarbonisation futures, including farm diversification, soil carbon, regenerative agriculture, bioenergy and others. And we're just approaching completion of a comprehensive database of potential solutions and are about to embark on the process of assessing these for impact and feasibility. And the last area where Land Use Futures is building on that analysis is we're including new analysis of northern semi-arid regions of Australia, which are often left out in these national land use analyses, given that most of the intensive agricultural production and land use happens in a very small zone around the eastern seaboard and southwestern Western Australia. So that program will be rolling out over the remainder of 2020 and 2021. So please do reach out if you'd like to find out more or get involved. So that's about enough from me. I'd now like to hand over to Shenggen to kick off the presentations. And Shenggen will be talking about the Global Food and Land Use Coalition's Growing Better report, which sets out 10 critical transitions for transforming food and land use globally, and also some of the global shifts we're already seeing towards these transitions. Thank you, Shenggen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me well? Can you see me? Yes. Let me first thank you. Thank you for organizing such an important discussion. Because our world, our planet is facing grave challenges. On the one hand, our diets are not healthy. Many people eat too much. Many people don't have enough to eat. So 800 million people suffer from hunger. 2 billion people suffer from hidden hunger, lack of micronutrients in their diet. And 2 billion people are overweight and obesity. Now, on the other hand, our natural resources are being depleted very fast. It's not sustainable at all. So that's why I want to thank you for organizing this important event. Now, I was very much involved in the FOLU report. How can we grow better? Make sure that we can feed everybody nutritiously, healthily, and to protect our natural resources. Now, the report proposed 10 critical transitions. I want to go through these 10 transitions very quickly, and particularly during the COVID-19. So COVID-19 started in January. Now 6 months, 5-6 months later, we can review how these critical 10 transitions have evolved over time. So number one transition is promoting healthy diets. I do think COVID-19 is a critical moment, maybe even an opportunity. We know that COVID-19 is a tragedy. Many people died, many people suffered. On the other hand, it might provide an opportunity for us to think very hard what we should eat in the future. Just from our survey in Asia, Southeast Asia and beyond, the consumers now are willing to change their behavior, to move towards more healthy diets. So for example, keep some distance from nature, from wildlife, and consume healthy foods so they can tolerate or have resistance against COVID-19. So that opportunity is there. Can we seize it? The number two critical transition is scaling productive and regenerative agriculture. This is agriculture. And again, even before COVID-19, we have seen tremendous investment in agriculture research to promote productivity, but also to make sure that we can protect our natural resources, the particular soil, water, and a rural environment. So we must continue to do that, particularly now many countries begin to introduce stimulus package to recover, to jumpstart the economy. So make sure that R&D investment is important to promote a more productive and a regenerative agriculture. The number three critical transition is to protect and restore nature. I think Annie mentioned about the nature. So here again, we continue to push some of the large producers and the suppliers, let's make a Brazil, to make sure that while they continue to produce meat, soybean, and even more products to feed the world, which is very much needed, but also protect the forestry over there. Again, some of the innovations, some of the partnerships, but the greening value chain, supply chain helps Brazilians to move towards greening agriculture, greening beef production. I think there is a lesson Australia could also learn. Now, number four critical transition is about the ocean, healthy and productive ocean. We have seen tremendous investment, private sector investment on deep ocean fishing or farming or fish farming and offshore farming. And we see that as an opportunity to promote healthy, nutritious, and also a less polluting diets for everybody. Now, number five critical transition is about diversifying the protein supply. Right now we rely on several major animal products, beef, pork, chicken, to feed ourselves. Can we do better? Can we promote plant-based proteins? For example, Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat. Again, we have seen the consumers are willing to change their diet, willing to, to consume plant-based proteins. And I think what we need is more investment, more R&D investment to bring down the prices, to change the taste, to make sure that more consumers are willing to consume. Now, the number six transition that is very critical is to reduce food waste and loss. We know that COVID-19 disrupted the food supply chains. So many slaughterhouses were closed, the transportation was disrupted, so lots of farmers killed the animals on farm, and lots of vegetables, fruits were wasted or lost. So we have seen increased waste. We have seen increased loss. Can we do better? Can government help to bring these foods to food banks? I don't know whether Australia have food banks. The food banks, and or bring them to processors so they can process all this fresh produce for future use and help the poor who are in need in short run. The number seven critical transition is to build local loops and the linkages, so rural-urban linkages. Again, we have seen much closer rural-urban linkages during the COVID-19. The consumers wanted to get access to healthy, nutritious foods, fresh foods, not from other countries. So the supply chains have become shorter. So they wanted to access food from their local communities. Can we see that opportunity, to do more? And particularly using internet platform, e-commerce. That's number 8 critical transition, harnessing digital revolution in food and agriculture. But as you know, now the e-commerce has almost doubled their business. In many countries, they even tripled. And again, the people are willing to change the way they purchase food, the way let's say they consume their food through internet delivery, through the internet let's say network to purchase their food. Now, number 9 transition is about the rural livelihoods. How can we build a much stronger rural livelihoods? So in Africa, there is a task force to revitalize rural areas. I think this must continue. So it's not just agriculture, it's not just food, but the whole rural area transformation and revitalization. And here in China, obviously, rural revitalization is a national strategy to make sure that food, agriculture, nature, the living standards, including clean drinking water, clean toilets, and so on, are part of that sort of revolution or critical transition. So finally, it's improving gender equity. From the COVID-19, we have seen that it is poor people, it is women, it is children, it is poor smallholders, it is poor consumers who suffered much more from COVID-19. Can we redesign our food system to make sure that everybody must benefit from the food system? Everybody must be able to consume nutritious and healthy diets. So COVID-19 is a crisis, is a tragedy. Can we seize it? Continue to push, continue to champion these 10 critical transitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Shenggen. And from my perspective, those global transitions do a really admirable job of, of portraying the integrated actions that we need to take globally to start to tackle this problem. And that's so important, because without a clear vision, the problem can seem simply too big, too hard, or too complex. I should also note that ClimateWorks is currently in the process of assessing these 10 global critical transitions in the Australian context, adapting them to our national circumstances, and looking at the current state of play for each of them. And we'll be publishing a series of discussion papers on each transition over the next few months, so look out for those. Now, just a reminder, if you have a question about anything Shenggen has said, you can submit it using the Q&A function. Plenty of questions already coming in, and we'll get to them shortly. But before we do, I'd like to bring in our other guest, Verity. So Verity is going to provide us with an overview of regional horizons. The 5-year plan Farmers for Climate Action has proposed to create new opportunities for jobs and industries while building a climate smart rural and regional Australia. Thanks, Verity.
Thanks so much, Ellie, and thank you to ClimateWorks for having me. I hardly feel qualified to come on after Shenggen, but hopefully I can bring it down from that global perspective to talk a little bit more about where we see things in Australia and how they can potentially move forward. Before I do that, though, I will just acknowledge the country on which I sit, which is the land of the Gubbi people. I find working in the land sector, particularly farming in an environment that is not my home environment, I'm a Western Australian adrift in Queensland, it's incredibly important for me to be able to lean on that expertise to build my knowledge of this landscape. And I think that's one that a lot of farmers around Australia are also starting to engage with, whether that is native grains or whether that is a whole range of other perspectives to assist us in our land management. So just quickly, if we can go to the next slide, please, team, that would be fantastic. Yep, next slide, please. Oh, so perfect. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off, for anyone who is not actually actively engaged in industry at the moment, just with a quick snapshot. So across Australia, we have 85,000 farm businesses supplying around 93% of Australia's food supply, and farmers are actually custodians for around 51% of Australia's land mass. Our industry supports 250,000 jobs right across Australia, and at the moment, over the last few years, we've been around a $60 billion industry. Agriculture is an incredibly important player. That's what these statistics show to us. You know, if we want to talk about climate, if we want to talk about sustainable futures, agriculture needs to be sitting at that table, hopefully in a driving seat. But unfortunately, what we can also see from the data is that, frankly, business as usual isn't really an option for Australian agriculture any longer. So we've seen $1 billion lost in productivity over the past 20 years. We've seen certain wheat producing regions which have had their productivity slashed by over 20% as a result of the climate change. If we consider the amount of research and development that has gone in, the incredible water use efficiency that Australian farmers demonstrate, it becomes very, very clear that we've got a serious problem. So we need to be able to embrace the opportunities and the challenges that come from that. If we look ahead, and I'm just going to draw on a little bit of data from the Australian Farm Institute and some research that they did last year, we can see that the modelling tells us that beef production in Queensland and the Northern Territory is expected to decline by up to 33% by 2050. That's a third of the industry gone over the next 30 years. These are not small figures. We could lose up to 70% of our wine growing regions, and we might see a decrease in our cotton yields by 17%. The simple fact of the matter is that at the moment we are typically focusing on incremental adaptation and improvements within agriculture, and we've done a fantastic job uptaking those efficiencies thus far. However, the time really has come for us to increasingly to step up, to recognise, if we go to the next slide please, that would be fantastic, to recognise that the extent of these impacts, and whether it is a 33% decline in beef productivity across the north or other factors, that is going to be directly impacted by the decisions that we take today. We control that. Sitting here right now, in whatever guise you are working within industry, in government, in philanthropy, or in the policy space, we control the impacts coming down the pipeline by our actions both domestically and with our global partners. So the very premise for Regional Horizons to come forward was to take advantage of that opportunity that COVID has created for our global community to really ask ourselves some critical questions. What do we value? Is it sustainable, thriving, resilient regional communities moving forward? Is it our clean, green, competitive advantage as a global exporter? What is it that we value, and how do we set a course towards the future that is going to deliver the best outcomes? Very simple premise. What future do we want? Are we prepared to play our part in protecting Australian agriculture and limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees on pre-industrial levels? That's where we go with Regional Horizons. So it is a 5-year, $1.8 billion program, which we are really now in the stage of engaging very deeply with industry, reaching out to potential partners to explore, you know, where does the alignment sit on this? Are we all on the same page in terms of taking our industry forward? How do we ensure that these voices are heard in a way that is able to deliver the kind of outcomes that farmers need? So there's 4 essential streams to the Regional Horizons program, and you'll note that I'm using the word regional, not just agricultural. It's because, as every farmer knows, we are part of a broader ecosystem that actually occupies our rural and regional communities. We need to make sure that this ecosystem is equally supported, because if we lose the schools, if we lose the hospitals, we see some challenges that really start to come out for our farmers in operating in those environments. Not only do we want our communities to be sustainable, we want them to be thriving into the future despite our increasing climate challenges. So the first stream of work that we believe needs to be delivered under that Regional Horizons program is to actually finalise and implement the National Climate Change and Agriculture Work Plan. So this stream of work is something that Farmers for Climate Action and many other industry bodies have been involved with the federal government consultation, with Ag Victoria consultation, in trying to get a policy that is actually going to deliver the kind of outcomes that agriculture needs, the research, development, extension, resourcing. The second stream of work that we're actually seeking to get supported, and this really goes to the heart of what Shenggen was saying before, around the valuing of our environment, valuing our natural capital within productive agricultural systems. And that's the implementation of a land and environment investment fund to potentially operate using the Clean Energy Finance Corporation model, so something that we can get up and running quite quickly, to actually be able to support the innovation, attract the sort of large-scale investment, de-risk that investment portfolio for institutional investors to engage in natural capital, reward ecosystem services, which is a conversation we've been having a lot in Australian agriculture at the moment. Shenggen, I don't know what you're seeing around the world. I'd love your thoughts on it, but it's a conversation that we've been having a huge amount of. How do we recognise and reward those ecosystem services that our farmers provide to the greater community? And of course, to promote climate solutions and resilience onto the land. The third stream of work, and you'll note again, I'm going back to our communities, because the third stream of work is around establishing regional resilience hubs. So to build on some of the successful examples that have rolled out around the world around decentralized learning networks, we know that some of the most successful adaptations occur when your network extends far beyond your local community, when your network extends around the country, but also around the globe, to tap into emerging best practice, the knowledge that is available, much like everyone who is on the webinar today can hear from Shenggen. That's what we want to see Australian communities and farming communities, rural communities, able to tap into on a regular basis. We want to empower these voices and want to encourage that innovation. And the final component of the Regional Horizons program, and I quite often get asked about, why are farmers talking about energy all the time? Why does it matter so much to you? And the third part of our regional energy transition, our Regional Horizons program, is actually the implementation of a regional energy transition scheme. Now, the design of that scheme is actually there to be able to support farmers to seize the new opportunities coming through for both energy and innovation, efficiencies on the farm, but also to be able to facilitate communities to determine a different future for communities who might be seeking to diversify beyond the fossil fuel industry, as we see a global change in our economics playing out over the next couple of decades. Support those communities to be able to have those conversations, to seek advantage of new opportunities that are coming online as a result of innovation, and also to be able to diversify those community income streams, whether that is through microgrids, whether that is through community energy projects, ensuring that when we are having these conversations with farmers and with rural Australia around what fosters a sustainable environment, we're actually considering the broader range rather than what is going on behind the farm gate. So Regional Horizons is the starting point. For us, this is an attempt of saying, well, how do we actually take the global trends that are occurring? How do we take the challenges that we're facing here within Australian agriculture? And I outlined some of those at the start. How do we take those challenges and turn them on their heads and use this as an opportunity? And we've seen recent research come out from the Regional Australia Institute demonstrating that there is growing interest in actually moving back to regional areas, which is extraordinary. So how do we use this opportunity when we have a bridge being built between our rural and urban centres to actually be able to maximise our chances at a sustainable and thriving future for rural and regional Australia? We can't do this alone. We're really welcoming input and engagement from industry and from stakeholders right across the spectrum, because realistically, we all need a thriving rural and regional Australia, because that shared prosperity is absolutely essential for all of us. So Ellie, I'll hand back to you now, but thank you.
Thanks so much, Verity. And I find Farmers for Climate Action's vision to be such a positive, optimistic vision for thriving rural and regional communities, created by rural and regional communities and backed up with a set of very pragmatic proposals for how to achieve that vision, and the opportunities there right now to progress those. So thank you, Verity. Once again, if you have a question about anything Verity or Shenggen have shared, you can ask it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we do have the rest of our time together this afternoon to answer those questions, for the panelists to answer those questions. So while you gather your questions, I'll kick things off with one question to sort of link those two presentations. We know that the Australian food and agriculture sector is widely regarded as clean and green, but developments like the EU carbon border adjustment suggest the threshold for clean and green internationally may be getting higher. I'm particularly interested, Shenggen, in your thoughts on what are the international trends that the sector needs to be paying close attention to in order to retain its competitive advantage.
Yeah, can you hear me?
It's a little bit quiet. Try again.
Okay. Is it better now?
That's good, thanks.
Is it better? Okay, yes. Well, I think Australia does have a good reputation to provide clean and safe foods. But in terms of environmental footprints, many consumers in importing countries simply do not know. Here in China is a big importer of Australian food. We need you guys to feed ourselves, right? And the Australians, I think, has a great potential to do more. Now, the Chinese is working with Brazilians to make sure that the food supply from Brazil is also carbon neutral. Can you do the same? I don't know yet. And we are working with beef producers, with Improper, this is a Brazilian agriculture research organization, and to make sure that, well, we do use some of the international standard. We know that the carbon footprints are from your production. And again, as I said before, the consumers now really increase their awareness about their carbon footprints while they're consuming meat. So that's sort of my take to you guys. I visited Australia many times. When I was Director General of IPRI, I knew that you do have enough technologies and lots of good practices. Probably it's not just communicated out to the consumers, say, hey, when you consume Australian products, whether it's beef, whether it's wine, whether it's fruits, vegetables, can you say that, well, you know, it also protects our environment? So that's really the question to you guys.
So I'll jump in. I'll jump in on that one, Ellie.
Help me to answer that.
So I actually think we've got a lot to be proud of. You know, I would point to MLA's Meat and Livestock Australia's carbon neutral by 2030 target. I would point to the work underway with individual corporates. I noticed someone's put the NAPCO story up, the 5 Founders brand, which is fantastic. But I would also point to the work of the grains industry, who just last week have come out with a carbon neutral target as well. You know, we are seeing some really positive moves afoot across Australian agriculture. Now, do we have enough support in terms of research and development funding coming through, particularly for the extension space? You know, are we actually giving our farmers enough support to be able to take up these opportunities? I know that there is tremendous appetite there. I know that we've got this capacity to move in this direction, and we certainly have a growing appetite to do so. I would question whether we have the adequate resourcing just at this point in time. And one of the components that actually we've included in our Regional Horizons paper, and I should say to the audience, it's actually more than just one slide, it's a full paper. But one of the components that we've actually put in there is actually talking about a climate-ready business leadership scheme. So not only are we actually calling for resourcing for a primary industries climate research and adoption program to work with the RDCs and the universities and the existing structures to take us in the direction that we need to go to maintain global competitive advantage, but also, you know, we need to make sure that we've got the soft skills. We need to make sure that our farmers, but also our industry more broadly. So when your bank manager is having a chat to the farmer, you know, they're not only able to talk about ecosystem services and emerging markets in that space, but also talk about climate risk, talk about carbon neutrality, what are the trends that they are seeing. We need to make sure that's able to flow across our agronomists as well. So this broader ecosystem in which farmers operate, we need to continually support that space to actually build skills in terms of climate preparedness.
Thanks, Verity. There's quite a few questions coming in. There are a couple that relate to the clean, green reputation of Australia, all of which kind of question, like, to what extent is Australia's food production sector actually clean and green globally? Some questions around the impact of grazing on land clearing and use of glyphosate and the bans happening in Europe around glyphosate. So I might throw to both of you to address those bucket of questions around the clean, green reputation of Australian food and agriculture.
Shenggen, you first.
Let me start. From a consumer's perspective, importing country's perspective, we know that Australia food products are high quality, are very safe. But we don't have much knowledge about how green it is, to be frank with you. I think you could do more. You know, if you have evidence, if you can certify, okay, this beef is indeed green or carbon neutral. And I think the consumers are willing to accept that. So this is probably a good business opportunity. But wine is another big item, not just the beef, so not just the fruits. You know. So that's one thing I think the Australia can do. Just for your information, the European Union reformed its subsidies from production subsidies to infrastructure investment to payment for eco-services. I think Verity mentioned about it, the eco-services. I don't know whether Australian governments are willing to pay or are already paying for that. Yes, absolutely. If farmers are doing something good for our planet, the whole society has to pay. It's not the poor consumers or not poor farmers. So European Union is doing that. US is planning to do that, or planning to scale up that payment. And here in China, even smallholder farmers, you know, my family I come from a smallholder farming business. And even here, you know, if we do some sort of practice to save the environment, to protect the environment, we got compensation. Going back to you.
Shenggen, I can hear farmers across Australia applauding at the moment, because I think this recognition for the ecosystem services that are provided is simply such a live issue. And at the moment, we do have a pilot program in its very early stages around biodiversity stewardship. But to us, this is actually where the Land and Environment Investment Fund becomes so critical, because that actually facilitates that greater certainty. There's obviously work that needs to be done around standardizing metrics and all of those components, the meta standards that need to be developed. But at the end of the day, we also need to have the incentive and the reward there, because Australian farmers do, for the most part, really do a good job in terms of looking after their environment. So recognizing that and actually making sure that this responsibility that farmers are generally very happy to take in terms of ensuring that there is greater community benefits is actually recognised in the way that our product is treated as well. And it's interesting feedback about the clarity around Australian food as being green as well, Shenggen. And I think there's a couple of RDCs that I saw in the attendee list, our research and development corporations. So I'm sure they'll be taking that one on as well.
Thank you to both of you. We've got quite a few questions around sort of exports and domestic supply. And I actually had a question that I was keen to ask both of you about on this front as well. Obviously, Australia's in the very fortunate position of producing much more food in Australia than we consume. And we haven't faced the same kinds of food insecurity issues that have been seen in other places around the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, of course, Australia is a major food exporter and deeply enmeshed in global trade and supply chains, and our exposure to trade shocks has become very apparent in the last month with the introduction of restrictions on beef and barley. I guess the question is, as the pandemic plays out, what do each of you see as the major risks the Australian food and agriculture sector might face, and how should we be thinking about ensuring future resilience to global trade and supply chain shocks? Maybe we could start with Shenggen.
Well, as an economist, I have been watching this very carefully, particularly global trade. Even starting February, the COVID-19 started in Syria. We came together with a statement saying that no country should use any ways.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? We're just having some issues with your audio. So if you wouldn't mind just starting that response again, and we might need to go to our backup plan if you try again and that doesn't work. So could you just maybe try again, go back to the beginning of that response, and if we're still having issues, I'll kind of wave and then you can dial in.
Okay, very good. Yes. So even starting in earlier February, some of the economists came together and issued a statement saying that no country should use export ban as a way to protect their own benefits or own interest. So open trade, transparent trade is so critical during crisis. Whether it's a food price crisis or whether it's a pandemic crisis and so on. So we made that statement. But unfortunately, some countries begin to use export bans. For example, Vietnam on rice, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan on wheat, and so on. This is not good. And also for for importers, I know some countries begin to restrain the imports of food, suspecting that the imported food could be contaminated by COVID-19. And so far, there has been no evidence. So we strongly oppose any actions to stop the trade, because trade is so critical. Trade is so important to feed everybody healthily, nutritiously during the food price, during the pandemic crisis. And again, we even today, we still think we must ensure that trade remains open. International trade, obviously domestic supply chains, the ports, everything has to be open. Could you imagine the Africans are importing $40 billion of food every year. And if that trade stops, how many people will go hungry? How many people will go undernourished? So that is our strong statement. And I know, different countries have different interests, or we also, oppose any sort of trade wars that could cause the destruction of the global food supply chains.
Thanks, Shenggen.
Hopefully you have heard me this time.
Yep, that was good, Shenggen. Thanks.
Eli, I would just add to that. I won't comment on the international trade dynamic. I think Shenggen's far more qualified than I to comment on that one. But I would just comment in terms of risks, sort of as we emerge out of this COVID phase for the way that I see it for Australian agriculture. And I would probably argue that the biggest risk that we face is not adequately seizing this opportunity. I think we've got so many compounding challenges, and we've had, a really interesting time in federal politics and the policy sphere at the moment with things like the Technology Investment Roadmap. We've had conversations around bioenergy. We've had the King Review. We've had the Climate Change Authority. There is this absolute litany of inquiries and reviews that have unfolded within that sort of climate and agriculture space just over the last couple of months. And I think that the single biggest risk that we could face is actually not seizing that opportunity to go, well, how do we do this better? How do we look critically? And I think, there's a few people on this call that I can pick out from industry who have been doing this work, really looking at what's going on critically. How do we actually take those next steps in the various R&D fields? And I mentioned, I called out grain growers and MLA as well before, and their various climate positionings. But I think, one of the other components where Australia has done such fantastic work globally, and this goes to Shenggen's point about people going hungry, is actually our entities like ACR, so the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. We in Australia have so much phenomenal potential to actually be really exporting our knowledge in dryland agriculture, arid rangelands management, all of these fields, we are world leaders. And if we look at things like the technology investment roadmap, and we've got the government currently talking about, well, how do we ensure that this reduces emissions globally? We need to ensure that we're also putting the skill set and the capacity for organisations that are well placed to do that, to actually deliver on those outcomes. So I think that's sort of where I would see some of the biggest risks for our sector emerging.
Thanks, Verity. I've got a question about oceans, which I thought was quite interesting. I'm not sure, Verity, if you have a perspective on this, but Shenggen, I think certainly you might. This question was around the use of ocean pens for fish farming and the environmental problems that that's caused. And it's been noted that that's been very detrimental for wildlife. And why is this method being considered as an environmentally responsible and sustainable option?
Well, to me, any modern farming is not just a deep ocean farming, but also this sort of vertical farming around big cities, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, could have negative impact on the environment. But modern technologies, modern practices, and a careful evaluation about their impact on the environment will be important. So I have seen some of the deep ocean farming. It's around, well, not Australia, the Singapore, Malaysia. So you have done carefully to make sure that you do not destroy the ecosystem around. And if you do that, you could actually provide alternative source of protein for everybody. But alternatively, you could also produce aquatic products inland, right, on your rice farming field. That's probably even more polluting. So you got to look at different alternatives. So yes, there are trade-offs. I think, Ali, you said that there are trade-offs, right? So how can we really minimize these trade-offs? Some positive, some negative, but make sure that positive benefits will overwhelm negative ones, or even negative impact can be sort of alleviated by other policies or technologies. And so there's no sort of one size fits all. You've got to analyze case by case. I think in some of the northern countries where it is very cold, or maybe some tropical countries where you have very rich ocean biodiversity, then you've got to be very careful when you develop deep ocean farming.
Thank you, Shenggen. Verity, jump in if you did want to say something about that, but otherwise I'll move on. So there's a question here with lots of congratulations about your report, but also a question that there really remains the political dimension which is required to create the policy and investment climate for real progress. And the question is, following FCA's ramped up activity over the past year, what are your views on what further needs to change?
So it's such a great question, and I was wondering whether the discussion around politics was going to come up. So first, it's an absolute no-brainer, but we need to depoliticize these conversations, and that means that it needs to not just be organisations that are climate focused who are driving that conversation. So when you have organisations and individuals who are very much identified as being centrist and not necessarily aligned to a climate perspective, their voices carry so much weight and can achieve so much in terms of depolarizing these conversations. So, I just encourage everyone to not just preach to the converted on issues related to climate, get outside our respective comfort zones, talk to those bodies who you wouldn't normally identify, whether that's talking to your bank, whether that's talking to others within industry who haven't been prominent on climate. Part of the role that FCA has played is trying to really open that space up as much as we possibly can for others in industry to, I guess, have a little bit more breathing room, to show the kind of courage and leadership that we've actually seen coming through from the agricultural sector. I would also say, for those on the call who are not directly involved in agriculture, I would say check out some of the resources that Farmers for Climate Action has been developing around how you can engage politically, particularly if you're someone who hasn't done so before. Don't underestimate the power of you starting to do so. let your elected representatives, regardless of where you sit, let your elected representatives know that you do actually want to see Australia seize the opportunities that are coming out of it, and let them know that you're paying attention.
Thank you, Verity. There are a couple of questions, including in the chat, around offsetting and carbon sequestration. One question was, can the panel comment on the relative importance of tree plantations for carbon sequestration in regional areas? I might quickly just mention, from the perspective of the work that ClimateWorks has done so far, the decarbonisation futures modelling did encompass a significant amount of carbon sequestration, up to 8 million hectares of planted area, which is very significant, in 2050 to offset the residual emissions from all of the other sectors of the economy, including agriculture, that couldn't be, that modelling was unable to find a way to eliminate. And I think we would be the first to acknowledge that while we've only modelled planting trees for that carbon sequestration, what that modelling result really says is what is the size of the gap in 2050 between the amount that we can reduce emissions across all sectors, including agriculture, and net zero. And obviously that isn't a strategy that can continue forever, nor is tree planting the only possibility for carbon sequestration. And those are things that the Land Use Futures program is looking at. Some commenters have also mentioned some of the environmental impacts of tree plantations, especially if they're monoculture plantations, and the water impacts are also a major issue. So I certainly acknowledge that those big issues are there. And that's part of what Land Use Futures will be looking at. I'll just see if either of the other panelists are keen to respond to that question.
Yeah, I'll jump into that one. So I think there's a really big conversation to be had within Australia about, one, the kind of landscapes that we want to see. And for everyone who hasn't yet read it, I really highly recommend having a look at CSIRO's Outlook report for 2019, because when you look at the land sector, there's some fantastic depictions of what mosaic landscapes can actually look like into the future, where you have productive, integrated trees in those landscapes in a way that is actually operating alongside new and existing, new and emerging industries. So I think that's one really good document to actually go and have a look at. But I also think when we talk about bioenergy, carbon capture and storage in the landscape, so we talk about BECCS in the landscape, there are going to be trade-offs. And I think this is the conversation which we haven't necessarily had in a great deal of detail in Australia. And we've seen it sort of play out with some of the emissions reduction fund work, where regional communities have felt like it's basically a lock up and leave policy. Now that doesn't actually deliver social outcomes, and therefore is not the desirable pathway for Australia to go down. You know, we're at risk of seeing in certain areas, one of the attendees has raised the point of monoculture. I'd also raise the comment around fire risk as well. So if we are actually integrating the offsetting component through vegetation into our climate solutions or sustainable development plans, then we need to have those conversations around how do we manage those risks. And we need to be quite open and evidence-based in the way that we do it. We can't really defer those conversations any longer.
Thank you, Verity. And I know that there
Can I also add a couple of points here?
Go ahead, Verity.
Yes, I think, okay, well, about a year ago, there was a report from the magazine of Economist saying that the planet actually is getting greener. Okay, that's largely because India and China are planting more trees. So the afforestation and so on. And here, in Beijing, it's much greener than before, and we have already benefited from that. Yes, we agree that different trees have different benefits or even negative impact on the environment, whether it's water or land and so on. By not, I think planting more trees is a positive development. So here, China, India, and Ethiopia. For China, they have a program for the green for grain. So basically convert all these fragile lands back to forestry or to pasture land. And I also have to acknowledge the support from Australians, to to restore some of the pastoral land here in China. So overgrazing, it was a problem in certain parts of the country. So here, I do think the planting more trees is a way to go beyond Australia. Australia, I don't know much about it. It's dry area, it's hot area, but here in our region, we have definitely benefit from planting more trees.
Thank you very much, Shenggen. Our time has absolutely flown, and we have many more questions that have been submitted. A number of them are asking for further information from the Food and Land Use Coalition work or from Regional Horizons, the Farmers for Climate Action work. And so we will pass them on to Shenggen and Verity and see if we can get answers offline to those questions. We'll also look at potentially what we can do to respond to some of the other questions that have been submitted and that we haven't managed to get to today. But it is almost 5 o'clock here in Melbourne and in most of the east coast of Australia. So I will close off. Before we finish, we do have one request. If you have a look in the chat box, which lots of you have been contributing to, which is wonderful, thank you. You'll see 3 links there. The first one takes you to a page with more information on the Decarbonisation Futures Report from ClimateWorks and the analysis that we did of the emerging technologies that can get Australia to net zero emissions. The second one takes you to a page on land use futures, where you can find out more about our program. And the third will take you to the Farmers for Climate Action Regional Horizons report, where you can learn more about that and get involved in spreading Farmers for Climate Action's vision for a clean regional-led recovery package. So before you log off, please click on at least one of them and read more, get involved and continue the conversation. I also want to remind you that our next briefing room event will be held on the 22nd of July when we'll be discussing the future of buildings. That event will be hosted by ClimateWorks Chair John Thwaites with a specific focus on retrofit opportunities. So keep an eye on your emails for that. We'll also be sending through information about signing up for that event and resources from today's session, including a full recording. Our 2 panellists for today's excellent discussion have been Verity Morgan-Schmidt from Farmers for Climate Action and Dr Shenggen Fan, Chair Professor at China Agricultural University. Thank you both for generously donating your time and sharing your insights. And I'd also like to thank again the ClimateWorks team and our incredible philanthropic supporters for making this work possible. We had over 200 people in the event audience today, which is fantastic. So thanks to all of you for attending, for your questions. Please do click on one of those links before you log off and reach out to us, to Farmers for Climate Action, and keep up to date via our social media channels as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I also thank you for Australia's support for international agriculture research, the CGIAR network, your financial support, your intellectual support. The whole global system has enough Australians working on global food security, nutrition, climate resilience, climate change. Let me use this opportunity to thank you. Thank you for your great support.
Thank you, Shenggen.